Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today we have someone very special. David Quinn is an Irish national commentator and a columnist with the Sunday Independent, which is Ireland's biggest and biggest newspaper, weekly newspaper. And David has been a columnist for since the 90s. We spoke before, so 30 years easily, more or less. So, David, it is a pleasure talking to you. And we're going to get into everything related to Ireland, the Jewish people, Israel, which ever since October 7th, a lot of people have started to look at what's happening in Ireland vis-a-vis Israel. And so it's a very interesting conversation. David, it's a pleasure and honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
So David, let's just start where we started. You've an Ireland native.
Hmm.
You've been there your whole life. It is your country. You're a commentator there in Ireland's most widely read newspaper, weekly newspaper. Why is it that, at least from my standpoint and from Israeli standpoint, the Irish people seem to be so, if not anti-Israeli outright, but so apprehensive towards Israel. Even those that aren't, make going to the streets weekly, it seems have like automatically a negative opinion towards Israel.
Yeah, so thank you. It's a really interesting question. So I divide the answer essentially into two parts. So part one, ordinary Irish people, and part two, Ireland's political and media class. So we look at ordinary Irish people first. If you do a poll of ordinary Irish people, you'll discover the vast majority are critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, but
Mhm.
they've been critical of Israel's actions in West Bank and Gaza and Lebanon for a very long time. All right. But at the same time, we had an election just late last year. And actually, the Israel issue barely featured at all, because for
Mhm.
ordinary people, the big issues are the typical ones: cost of living, housing, high immigration. I think we probably come around to that. And Israel at the doorsteps barely figured. Because if you pull anybody aside and you ask them for an instant opinion about something, all right, the instant opinion will be Israel bad, Palestinians
Yes.
good. But then they kind of stop thinking about it. Now, the political class and the media class and the academic class, so that kind of thing, is a totally different story. Um, Deep, almost uniform hostility towards Israel that runs really, really deep. And is to be found essentially across our political class. Like I was speaking some time back to an Israeli diplomat, and he was telling me that what's unusual about Ireland is, so in a country like Belgium, which has in Ireland, sorry, an anti-Israeli political wing, or Spain, or one of these countries, that sooner or later there'll be a government in power that you can deal with, usually on the centre right.
Yes.
But in Ireland, no matter who's in power, that government is going to be anti-Israeli, which means that Israeli diplomats have almost no friends here. They have a few isolated politicians here and there, but they have no party that when it comes into power, they can say, this is going to be a little bit more friendly to us than the last government. No, it's just hostility, hostility, hostility all the way. And what I found really striking. So I went on one of our major TV programs about, maybe this is October 7th, sorry, October 11th, we'd say, only a few days after the massacre.
Hmm.
And like immediately, it was accusations of Israeli war crimes, Israeli genocide. There was almost no talk about what actually happened on October 7th. So I tried to pull the conversation back to Hamas. I tried to bring it back to Iran and its role in the whole thing. I tried to bring it back to Hezbollah. But there was no interest in doing that. It was immediately, we're going to talk about the terrible things Israel is doing and is about to do. So October 7th, what happened actually among our political class, media class, and so on, engendered no sympathy towards Israel, really, that was in any way detectable. Because, for example, on October 7th itself, you saw people like the Sinn Féin leader. So, Sinn Féin is the biggest opposition party. It would be positioned on the left. It is the political wing, or it was, of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA.
Hmm.
Okay. And it's always been extremely anti Israeli. So,
Right.
anyway, when October 7th happened, various Sinn Féin politicians start putting up on their Twitter profile a picture of the Palestinian flag, not the Israeli flag. And in fact, unlike in many other countries, on October 7th, Israeli flags were not displayed in front or on top of Irish public buildings. And this is happening all over the place, but not in Ireland. And that was extremely striking. And also, there seemed to be no proper expressions of sympathy and no visits out to our small Jewish community. So even October 7th didn't seem to switch anything much here.
But why? That's my like why? Why is that happening? Why, like you said, if the UK, let's say the UK or uh, Italy, so you'll have the lefty parties in, they'll be anti-Israel, more or less, depending.
Mm,
Even the left parties in UK and everything, they'll have members of parliament that'll be more sympathetic. There'll be some sort of, it'll be an issue of contention to somewhere or another inside the party even. And then if the right comes in, it's more or less
mm.
supportive of Israel, maybe not all the way, but you'll have some people in the party that are supportive. It's not uniformly the entire country's against Israel. What makes Israel such an issue that's pretty much from wall to wall agreed upon that we don't like Israel?
Yeah, so I think part of it is to do with Ireland's origins as an independent country.
Hmm.
So we become an independent country in 1922, and of course we become independent from Britain. And Ireland has always had a kind of strong, I'll put it this way, anti-imperialist streak within its politics, and it makes us kind of sympathise with what we consider to be oppressed people.
Hmm.
And so the Palestinians are regarded as an oppressed people. And so we see kind of the Palestinians as like the Catholics of Northern Ireland, still under British rule.
Mm.
All right. And we see Israel as like the British. All right. So Israel equals Britain. Palestinians equal the Catholics of Northern Ireland, particularly in the past when there was a lot more oppression going on in the north than there is now, because it's a much more settled place than it used to be. So I would say that's the number one reason for the attitude. Now,
Can I
what
stop
I,
you there just to
yeah,
like, just the analogy is very flawed, I think, right? And for a number
okay,
of reasons, just
hmm,
before we go on to the next reason, is that
yeah,
first of all, historically, the person on the street gets it, I guess, from culture and from whatever he hears in the media and from his politicians, but the sentiment seems to be that, like you said, Israel is the occupier, the oppressor, the British oppressor, and the Palestinians are the Irish people that are fighting the oppressors, the colonizers. But
hmm.
on the other hand, the Jews in Israel were the ones who fought the British here. So before the establishment of the state, I think that it was a bad idea, but we were bombing British installations. With King David Hotel in Tel Aviv, where we killed a lot of British people. Menachem Begin was considered a terrorist by the Brits. He was
Hmm.
wanted. So in a way, we should have had like a kinship with the IRAs or their supporters. And secondly, um, the colonizer aspect of it always seems weird to me, not only in the just in general, that it seems historically there was always Jews in the area here. Even when the Jews left, there was pockets of Jews. Most of the area was pretty much abandoned for most of the time. The Arabs here are not ethnically connected specifically to this land. They're from Arabia, more different areas around here, not specifically here. So how do you think it became like settled science, so to speak, that this connection between the two struggles?
Well, I mean, so when I'm in debates about this sort of thing with people, I say, well, hang on a minute, and I kind of make your point that the Jews also had a national struggle,
Yeah.
essentially. And I say, so Zionism is used as a swear word. And I say, well, Zionism basically means Jewish nationalism.
Yes.
And Ireland had its nationalist movement. So we ought to be able to recognize fellow nationalist movements. Now, it so happens we recognize the Palestinian nationalist movement, but we won't recognize the Jewish nationalist one. And the other thing, we despite the Holocaust, um, we don't really, certainly for the last few decades, really see the Jewish people as a kind of historical victims. Or if we do, that's all history. It's over now. And in fact, the Jews should have learned from their own history, not to be doing what Israel is doing.
Yes.
This is kind of, the mentality that's going on. But I think another part of it is You see, Ireland was neutral in World War II, and we're obviously right up there on the northwestern edge of Europe. And so, we're not in a locality that's had to worry about anything but Britain. It's not we were like one of these invasion superhighways like Poland or
Hmm.
Ukraine that has enemies coming in from all directions. So we only had Britain to contend with. That was enough to be getting on with. But very few Jews in Ireland, ever. And so the Holocaust didn't arrive in Ireland. We never saw Jews being taken away on trains in Ireland. I think that at the peak, the Jewish population of Ireland, we'd say in the 1970s or 80s, might have been about 5,000. And I think most Jews who came to Ireland came here after some of the Russian pogroms.
Mm.
And they ended up coming from places like Lithuania and Latvia, so far as I know. And so a lot of the Jews here to this day are descendants of the Jews who fled from the Russian pogroms. And by the way, for the most part, they settled in pretty well in Ireland. There was one or two bad incidents. There was a kind of semi-pogrom in Limerick about 100 years ago, and that's kind of a stain. But for the most part, Jews in Ireland will tell you they settled in pretty well. You did get some anti-Semitic sentiment, we say, in the 1940s, but for the most part, they have encountered nothing, certainly in recent decades, but friendliness personally, because the Irish are by and large a friendly people. All
Hmm.
right. But however, as I say, because we were neutral, because we only had a small Jewish community, because the Germans never got here, we never saw Jews being taken away on trains the way other countries did. So therefore, the Holocaust is not really part of the national memory here. So I think that's part of the reason why we don't have the sympathy towards the Jewish cause that I think we ought to have. So it's because of our kind of distinct history, whereas nearly every other country in Europe, there's kind of guilt about it. Because
Hmm.
as we know, in countries like France and elsewhere, there was too many people happy to see the Jews being put away on the trains,
Yes.
weren't they? Like, I mean, this is a big part of the problem, and so therefore they saw it. Some of them took part in it, and there's guilt. So we don't have that guilt because we didn't take part.
But
So this
that's a
is why I
good thing,
think,
by the way.
yeah, of
Why
course,
would you would not want to be
no, no, and I don't know what we'd have done, had the Germans come here and suddenly we saw Jews being put away on trains and never seen again. So I don't know how we'd have behaved. Probably some would have behaved badly, and some would have behaved well. Probably would have been fairly typical from that point of view. But anyway, it means that we just don't weirdly identify with the Jewish nationalist cause. And like even when Israel became independent in 1948, it took quite some years for us to kind of de jure recognize the state of Israel. You see, we considered ourselves a neutral country. We're kind of non-aligned. We identified with the third world, and to a certain extent, that's still the case. And again, for some reason, Israel wasn't included among those. You did have for a while, because Zionism was often socialist. You had socialist politicians in Ireland, let's say in the 1960s and 70s, who did identify with Israel. And then all that stopped. And it seemed to stop, particularly from around the 1980s when the wars in Lebanon began to take place. That's kind of, it seems to me, when the patience of the Irish left began to wear out. So that old romantic socialist attachment to socialist Zionism began to disappear. And all that generation of politicians who used to kind of romanticize Zionist socialism is now departed from the scene. So this means the number of potential sympathizers to Israel in this country just keeps on diminishing.
we spoke about the this is the lack of guilt. So, but also in the US, there's not guilt, I would say, and people are less inclined to look at Israel as a sort of colonial, at least in the polls even, and policy-wise, it translates. There was no Holocaust in the US, and yet the Americans, maybe because there's a lot of Jews in America, so they do have, you see Jews in the streets, you see Jews at
Mm-hmm.
your workplace, you see Jews
Mm,
in politics, in
mm,
Hollywood, obviously. So there is a
mm,
difference, but there's not the guilt that you talked about. I do think also that just on a moral basis, people shouldn't be motivated only by guilt. You would think
mm-hmm.
that people would be a little more open-minded to other, I guess, uh, arguments and stuff. So, what is the second reason? And then we'll get to maybe some examples of what it is to be, what is happening in Ireland in the public debate.
Well, I mean, just let me say about America first. You see, again, Ireland was neutral in World War II. America
Yeah.
obviously wasn't. And so, American soldiers saw the camps, for example. And also, if I have my history right, when the Suez War broke out in 1956, the Americans weren't very impressed with that. So actually, I think
Yes.
it took a while before the Americans went in, fully behind Israel. And I
Yeah.
think that began to arise more and more and more in the context of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union was backing the Arab states and America began to back Israel ever more. And I think the real kind of marriage, if you like, of Israel and America particularly happened, I think, in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. I think
Yes.
that's when America really got on board.
Hmm.
So there was all kinds of geopolitical reasons as well for America to get involved. And of course, we considered ourselves to be neutral and out of that. Um, and I mean, I'm trying to remember now what the second reason was for our lack of sympathy. Um,
I have another
but I,
reason that maybe I can ask you about.
okay,
It seems that there is in general in the UK where I'm a little more versed. We've had in their last election, think about 5 or 6 MPs plus what's his name, the guy who used to be the leader of the Labour, Jeremy Corbyn, were
hmm,
elected exclusively on the Gaza issue. So
I
not
remember the
talking
second
about
reason. I remember the second reason. But anyway, you finish your
so
question first.
they
Yeah.
were elected basically just talking about Gaza, nothing about their districts, nothing about how to help people that live in the UK, just about stopping the Gaza war, genocide, and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
And so my question is whether this also is happening in Ireland, where the immigrant population is becoming more and more because of in the West in general, and I assume also in Ireland, the amount of people having children is way down. The amount of people that are of voting age of Irish descent is probably less than it was as a share of the population. More and more immigrant population is growing, or children of immigrants from different Islamic countries, and their sympathies go to the Palestinian cause. And therefore, it's also, in addition to everything we just said, placated on the political stage. People want their votes. It's an issue, and it becomes an issue. Does that happen also in Ireland?
No, not really, because we only have a very well. So Ireland is about 5.5 million people,
Hmm.
um, and the Muslim population of Ireland is maybe 80,000.
Ah,
And
that's it.
so, yeah, so it's small. So therefore, unlike in Britain, you don't have very large and quite a large number of constituencies in which the kind of Muslim vote, if I can put it that way, matters. So that's not really an issue here. The second reason, so the first reason I was offering was there's a kind of because there's a lack of direct historical memory of the Holocaust here, which means I think we don't sympathize with the Jewish national history and experience the way we ought to. But the second reason is because even if we had, um, the left here, and you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn,
Yeah.
thinks very like Jeremy Corbyn. All
Mm.
right. So independent of everything, they just were saying that they just see Israel as settler colonizers. Okay, and so they're part of this whole kind of international left-wing attitude towards Israel that's deeply hostile towards Israel, and unfortunately, as I say, is shared across the political spectrum. So not simply in parties that will be aligned with a Jeremy Corbyn point of view, but even parties that, if they were elsewhere in Europe, so this would be Fianna Fáil, which is the main governing party, and Fine Gael, which is the partner in government. And Fine
Mhm.
Gael is traditionally a Christian Democrat party. So the historically Christian Democrat parties on the continent tend to be sympathetic towards Israel. But in Ireland, because of the peculiar nature of our politics, they're not. And in fact, the leader of Fine Gael, Simon Harris, is just a vociferous critic of Israel. And then Micheál Martin is the leader of Fianna Fáil, so it's kind of calls itself the Republican Party, also a vociferous critic of Israel. And they have been since essentially day one. I was going to give some examples, by the way, of what's been going on here. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I think, and so the president of Ireland, who some of your listeners may have heard of, because I think he's got quite a lot of publicity in Israel, is President Michael D. Higgins.
Hmm.
So, Michael D. Higgins would essentially be an identikit of Jeremy Corbyn in his outlook on the world. And so he's been a long time critic of Israel. This goes back way before October 7th. And he would say, he would probably argue Israel is bringing a lot of its troubles on itself because of its behavior down the decades. He is somebody who has friendly relations with Iran. So you see,
Hmm.
this is the kind of perverse thinking. Iran is part of the anti-imperialist struggle, and therefore we sympathize with Iran. In fact, senior Iranian diplomat in Ireland recently was brought into our Parliament building, Leinster House, and got a friendly reception. Whereas we have a situation, as again your listeners will hopefully know, that Israel withdrew its ambassador to Ireland a
Yes.
few months ago. Meanwhile, the Iranian charge d'affaires, I don't think they have a full ambassador, is getting a welcome into Leinster House despite their support for Hezbollah and their support for Hamas. So this is the really kind of perverse thinking that's going on. We're supposed to be neutral, but that's not neutrality. That's
Hmm.
alignment, and it's
Yes.
alignment with Iran. And this is appalling. And very strong sympathy, as far as I can see, from our president, and not enough hostility from our government towards Iran. Um, and we've had examples of a few months ago, there was an Israeli man. He was spat at in a pub by some
Yes.
left-wing activists. I don't know how they spotted him. I don't know how it all developed, but there she is, and she's on video. She's proudly spitting at him, and she was a member of People Before Profit, which is one of the hard left parties. About a year ago, there was a Jewish man. I don't know if he was Israeli or not. He may have been an American Jew, and he was in a pub in Ireland, and he was wearing a Star of David. So he said he got punched. There was a Fine Gael politician. I mean, she was a local politician. She wasn't a national politician. And she announces at one of these, local council meetings, well, of course, the Jews control the American economy. Okay, so this is classic protocol of the elders of Zion kind of
Yes. It's
tropes,
not even
right?
anti-Israel,
Yeah, that
just
the Israeli,
anti-Jewish.
yeah,
Yeah.
so like Jews have I don't know. I mean, it's this weird ancient trope. The Jews have almost some kind of magical powers over money, and so you hear that often being repeated. And other politicians, particularly on the left, talking about the power of Jewish bankers. And I mean, this will be an incredibly familiar trope to you, but this is regularly used on the left, in particular, of Irish politics. And these people are rarely properly disciplined. So this particular Fine Gael councillor I mentioned, it took months before anything happened, and then it was simply mildly disciplined. And when you
Mm.
think of how cancel culture bears down very hard on people for doing other things, cancel culture doesn't really work when people say things like that. Ireland, of course, has joined the South African genocide case,
Yes.
which didn't exactly help our image in Israel because we were one of the only countries in Europe to do so. We recognized Palestine a few months ago, I think, along with Spain, and was it Belgium or Norway? I can't remember which the third one was. And so, completely getting ahead, Hamas wasn't required to do anything because we don't put moral pressure to speak of on Hamas. We don't put moral pressure on Iran as backer. All the moral pressure comes to bear on Israel. And it
Yes.
was a particularly egregious example a few months ago when President Higgins was addressing the Holocaust memorial event in one of our main public buildings in January. And he's not well got by the Jewish community in Ireland. Um, and so there was kind of a debate about should we even attend this. But one Israeli woman, actually, it was four, stood up in silent protest at him. And one of these Israeli ladies was dragged out. I don't know if you saw any of that at the time. It went quite
Yes.
viral. So I
Hmm.
think this was the only Holocaust memorial event in the world where a Jewish woman got dragged out because she was objecting to
And
the
she was doing
speaker.
it quietly. She was just standing, right?
Yeah, 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 and gets dragged out. So it was quite amazing, and also like Israel and Ireland didn't exchange ambassadors until the 1990s,
Hmm.
so it was very late in the day, and relations, as I say, have never been good. And now, of course, Israel has withdrawn its ambassador to Ireland, so it's a whole accumulation of things. And we're actually kind of proud that Israel has withdrawn its ambassador
Yes.
because it just makes us feel more righteous that has done this. And now we are objecting to the presence of Israel in the Eurovision. And we
Yes.
want Israel
I
to be
know.
banned from the Eurovision.
That's your
But
TV station, the I guess the state-run TV, right?
yeah, RTE,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. So
They
they're,
officially launched a complaint demanding that the Israeli singer, which by the way, she herself was in the Nova Festival, and she
mm,
survived because
mm,
she hid under dead bodies in a
mm,
shelter when they were throwing grenades in and killed all the people. She
yes.
managed to hide under bodies of dead friends, and they want her to she wasn't a soldier, she was a civilian in a party, and they want
Mhm.
her not to attend, like, not to be part because she just happens to be Israeli. That's the gist of the argument.
Exactly. And you see, also, I've even seen it suggested that sending her along is politicizing the contest. So Israel is pulling a fast one by sending her
Yes.
along. Okay, so this is the kind of mentality you've got to deal with. But actually, in my commentary since and my writings about everything to do with Israel and the conflict since October 7th,
Hmm.
I've concentrated quite heavily on the topic of the sense of isolation that our tiny Jewish community in Ireland, is now down to about 2,500 people, feels, because they do feel isolated. There was very little outreach to them, as I said, even in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. Um, they weren't sure how the Holocaust Memorial Day would be used. They were uncomfortable with such a strong critic of Israel, namely Michael D. Higgins, giving the main address at it, and they felt it shouldn't have been somebody who the Jewish community feels more comfortable with. So they felt this was kind of an imposition upon them. Um, so a lot of my commentary is trying to give a sense to Irish people of the sense of isolation that our very small Jewish community feels, and also to try and remind people what Zionism actually is, Jewish nationalism, and to remind people, like historically, over a long period of time, Jews have been safe essentially nowhere, and this is why a Jewish homeland is so important. Because you have to kind of remind people of the likes of the Russian pogroms, which I think is what
Yes.
originally led to the rise of Zionism. It wasn't the Holocaust; it was the Russian pogroms, and then of course the Holocaust obviously gave us the need for a Jewish homeland far more impetus and far more urgency. So I would tend to write about that kind of thing just to remind people, hang on a second, there's a context here.
Yes. And do people even know the history, like in general, of, for example, just I'm just thinking the fact that most Israelis nowadays aren't white European descent, Ashkenazi. Most Jews in Israel are either mixed or of Arab country descent. So they're, I guess you would call brown. So like my wife is Persian and Iraqi, Iranian and
Mm-hmm.
Iraqi. So, and I'm European descent, but my kids will be half and half, and who knows what their kids will be. So, and most Israelis are like that. And so when they say the white colonizers and all this kind of stuff, it's just factually like lacking. Also, the fact, so do they know that? Also, when you go to these debates, do they have any clue what happened to the Jews, more than I think a million Jews in Arab countries after the state of Israel was established? The fact that people were thrown out of the countries, that there was pogroms in Iraq and in Libya and all these other countries, all of people's belongings were stolen from them. Morocco, all these other
Mm-hmm.
places where Jews had to run away, literally escape. Is that no one knows about that, right? No one talks about
No,
that.
I mean, I think the average person would have no awareness of the distinction between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews.
But
All
isn't that
right.
important in the sense if you're saying that the Israelis are the white colonizers
Mm,
who are colonizing the like Aboriginal brown Palestinians. So it's white against black and brown people. But
hmm
then if factually the Israelis are not whites. And so
hmm
that turns the whole argument on its like when my friend who's an Ethiopian Jew goes to American college campuses, they're in shock. A black
mm,
Jew Israeli. So
mm.
does any of that even translate that there's not that the Israelis aren't specifically white?
Not remotely. And also, there'd be very little awareness of the expulsion of Jews from
Yes.
various countries in the Middle East. I'd say there'd be nearly zero awareness of that, and there'd be almost zero awareness, by the way, in 1948 that there was an attempt to instantly
Yes.
strangle the Jewish state of birth. There'd be no real awareness of this. There would be an awareness that, as a result of the 1948 war, Palestinians were expelled, at least some of them, from their homes. So to be an
Mm.
awareness of that, but not an awareness actually, well, look what happened in the rest of the Middle East. And again, look what happened in 1948 itself, an attempt to immediately extinguish the Jewish state. So we get an incredibly one-sided story here.
Yes.
Which, by the way, I mean, it makes it. I mean, there's only a handful of us in Ireland in the Irish media would be sympathetic to Israel. and kind of sympathetic overall to the kind of what I'll say is Jewish nationalist cause. All right, so it's an incredibly hostile environment to be in. And if you're commenting or you're going on social media onto Twitter, so I have a Twitter account.
They kill you.
Um,
They
what's
they
that?
they don't give you a they really viscerally go after you.
Totally. And I mean, you're just the whole time accused of being a kind of genocide
Yeah,
supporter and
yeah.
all that kind of thing. I mean, it's actually from Ireland, like even for somebody like myself, who I think, is reasonably well aware of what sources to go looking at. It's quite hard to follow the war properly,
Yes.
because the Irish sources are very anti. All right, so you're getting particularly anti view. And then I look at Israeli newspapers, and I'm not entirely sure which ones are giving a balanced account of the war.
I'll
And
give
so
you
there,
I'll talk to you about that after.
that'll be good. That'll be good. Something
Yes.
I can actually say, well, okay, this is a completely trustworthy news source
Yes.
about what's happening. So it's quite tricky, and that's why I tend to concentrate on how are we treating the Jewish community right now in Ireland. I mean, I forgot to mention, by the way, that there was um, uh, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, a mohel.
Yeah.
Yeah,
A
the
guy
people.
who does the circumcision on Jewish boys at 8 days old.
Yes. So a British mohel was brought over to Ireland because the community in Ireland is too small to have one of its own. And of
Okay.
course, again, as you know, it must take place by the eighth day. So he comes over. He's recognised in Britain for such purposes because he belongs to the British Mohel Society, which is one of the oldest societies of any kind in Britain that goes back to the 1700s. And he
Hmm.
gets arrested
For what?
because he hadn't been registered as a person qualified to carry out circumcisions in Ireland. All right. Now, so you could argue, well, okay, he should have got registered. But on the other hand, we should have an arrangement with Britain whereby we recognize people from the British Mental Health Society. So it just wasn't a good look
Hmm.
that for the first, I think we were the first country in Europe in decades to arrest a Mohel for wishing to carry out a circumcision. And by the way, he's still awaiting trial.
Oh,
So
he's still arrested?
he was held in an Irish prison for a few weeks,
Wow.
and then he was released pending trial. So the trial is to take place later this year. So it remains to be seen what's happened. But you can imagine what that makes us look like. But what I noticed, by the way, when I was writing about this, there was exceedingly little sympathy for him because I think most people think that circumcision for religious reasons is unjustifiable. All right.
Maybe so, but still, arresting someone for you don't have to agree with the practice, but they were going to do it. The question was,
Mm.
I guess, who was going to do it? Uh, so, but
So I don't know if this, I mean, I don't know if this 8 day old boy ended up having a circumcision. I don't know what happened. I
it's a
think they
good
went
question.
north. I think they went north and found somebody
Yeah, they probably went somewhere else to do it, so they
up to
just
Northern
had to
Ireland.
they had to work harder to get it done. That's basically the gist. Um, can I walk around with a kippah.
Yeah.
Would I be able to walk around with a kippah in Ireland without getting someone saying something about Jews to me, about Israel? Do you think in Dublin I would be safe? It's not safe in the sense, maybe it is in the sense of people punching me, but even saying things derogatory or things like you said that they write to you on your Twitter or
Mm.
people screaming at you about genocide and while you're drinking in a pub. What do you think it would be? There's a good chance that I wouldn't encounter that, or
I couldn't guarantee that you wouldn't be harassed.
oh,
Because I do know, obviously, a number of the Irish Jewish community here. And so one of them, he's head of the Irish Jewish Representative Council, and he's gone public about this. His name is Morris Cohen. He's a great man. And like Morris said, well, for all my decades, and I grew up in Ireland, I've never been harassed ever. But he said for the first time, he's kind of nervous about being publicly Jewish.
yeah.
And I gave the two examples of I think he was an American Jew getting punched in an Irish pub or nightclub, and then this other fellow getting spat at. So no, I could not guarantee that there wouldn't at least be verbal harassment if you were seen to be wearing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it would probably not happen, but it might happen. So therefore, there's no guarantee it would not happen.
So you would advise me not to walk around with it just for safety reasons.
Unfortunately, I probably would, yeah, particularly in around the city centre, because
Mm,
the city centre is where you get a lot of the kind of political activists hanging around and that kind of thing.
okay.
Um, so there's certain areas, and I think I could put you safely down in those areas and say, I think you can walk around this area, and that won't happen. But it's a terribly sad thing
Yeah.
that we are at a point where I'd have to issue a kind of advisory on that one.
What about of the tiny Jewish community? You said there's about 2,500 Jews left
Mm.
in Ireland. Do they have synagogues, community centers? Are those guarded with high security? Just in general, how does it feel to live as a Jew in Ireland nowadays? Do you have to constantly have your places of worship, for, like I said, synagogues be very high security? Do they have, like, how does it work? Their schools, stuff like that.
Well, I was at an event. It was the specifically is Israeli commemoration of the Holocaust, which took place only a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember what you actually called the event. It's separate
Yom
from the one that
HaShoah.
takes. Yes, thank you. So it took place near the synagogue, and of course there was a lot of security. But there's been a lot of security for quite some years because they're always worried about protests, and they've been worried about protests for some time. There's never been an attack in the synagogue, thank God.
Thank God.
Um, and you'd hope it'll never come to that, and that Ireland will never get as bad as, let's say, parts of Sweden and so on, where there's
Yes.
really high security. And
Malamo and all those.
yeah, and there have been attacks in synagogues. So I really hope it doesn't get that bad here. Famous last words. I don't think it will, but once upon a time I would have said it definitely won't. So
Mm,
there's a bit of a shift. Um, uh, so we have one major synagogue in Ireland. There used to be more when we had a bigger community.
yeah.
It's a reasonably active synagogue. I mean, I think like the Jewish community here is now a bit like kind of the Catholics of Ireland. There's less practice than there used to be.
Yes, I'm going to ask you
Okay,
about that
yeah,
because one of the things we've seen all over the West, except for Israel, by the way,
mm,
which is an interesting
mm,
reason to talk about why it's happening. The
mm,
entire West, Christianities, no one's people are not going to church like they used to.
mm,
There's just even in people believing in God is way down,
mm,
especially in organized religion, way down. People aren't going to church. Churches in the UK, I just read, are being made into like restaurants and mosques. So there's
mm.
a sort of leaving, at least of organized religion, and people are not having that sense of community that they used to have. The Does that translate, you think, into more hatred of Israel? Meaning the fact that you're looking for something to hold on to, that you don't have that community, that you don't have that support system that you would have had 20 years ago with the church. You're now having to look for it somewhere else, and you're finding it in these protests. You're finding it in these, being justice for Palestine and all this kind of stuff. Do you think that plays into some of that?
I'm not 100% sure because obviously there's a shameful history of Christian anti-Semitism.
Yes,
And so you might also have thought that as Christianity fades in Europe, so will that kind of more
exactly.
old-fashioned source of
It's a
anti-Semitism.
good point.
But instead, it seems to have been replaced. Um, and so obviously I mean, again, here's the weird dynamic at work. Um, the Holocaust causes guilt throughout Europe about the treatment of this particular minority. And so it begins to tip many people, particularly on the left, over in favor of multiculturalism and the correct treatment of minorities.
Hmm.
And so, as a result of the guilt engendered by World War II, and particularly by the Holocaust, we decide we must embrace multiculturalism. But a certain part of that multiculturalism is now making Europe once again less safe for Jews.
Exactly.
So this is the weird part of it, because I mean, again, this is kind of like the thing you're not allowed to talk about, particularly in Ireland. But we know where a lot of that anti-Semitism is coming from. It's coming from the more militant sections of the Muslim communities. Now,
Yes.
I'm going to say the more militant sections because obviously many are not like that. But we should be
Hmm.
allowed to say that because if we can't identify one of the quarters it's coming from, then we're in trouble. So this is the weird side effect of multiculturalism, that the wrong kind of multiculturalism is leading to more anti-Semitism
Yes.
in order to solve the anti-Semitism that erupted in its worst ever form in World War II. And as I say, we don't have too much of that in Ireland. So I would stress again, a lot of the hostility is towards Israel,
Hmm.
not Jews. But what worries me is some of the people, some of the politicians on the left, while I don't think most of them are anti Semitic, they are too inclined to be what I call anti Semite adjacent, by which I mean too inclined to be cozy with the Iranians. They've sometimes shared platforms with people from Hamas. That's not a good look, or
It's
from
not just a good
Hezbollah,
look.
right?
It's a
So I'm not anti Semitic, but here's my buddy who definitely is. And I don't mind sharing a platform with him.
yes.
That's a
Um,
problem.
it's not only it's not just a bad look. It's a bad thing. It's
Mm,
it's
mm,
yeah. It's like anyway. Um, do you, as someone who does write, I would say I read some of your stuff. It's not like you're going and saying Israel is the best ever.
mm.
We have to like cheer Israel. You are trying to be fair in your columns. You're trying to, as an and like you said, you're mostly talking about just not hating Jews in Ireland, making them feel safe, making Ireland a place where Jews. And yet, I was looking at your social media. I was looking at things that people wrote about you online, not on social media even. People like really hate you. And it
Mm-hmm.
seems to me that like they're not really hating you for any real like the only reason why they hate you is because you're pointing out like let's stop hating Jews, like this is not like a shouldn't be a controversial thing.
Yeah, but it's almost impossible to have a rational discussion about this because, again, I've been fairly careful in my commentary not to defend all Israeli actions in
Yes.
Gaza. I mean, some of them look very bad. The current situation with the food flow into Gaza looks
Hmm.
bad. So therefore, I don't defend that. Um, so again, what I do is, as we've been discussing here, is I try to say, well, okay, are we cottoning on to the fact that we are Iran sympathetic? Are we cottoning on to the fact that on the hard left is sympathy for the likes of Hezbollah and Hamas? So I just try to highlight
Yeah.
these things. And again, the isolation that the Jewish community feels. Like another incident I didn't mention was this was only a few months after October 7th. Student union protesters in Trinity College Dublin, which is our oldest and most prestigious university. It goes back to the very late 16th century. And Ireland's most famous national treasure, the Book of Kells, which was the product of early Irish monks. It's a beautiful gospel,
Hmm.
and it's in Trinity. Tourists come in to see it, and it was blockaded by the radical student union protesters who basically wanted Trinity College to join the BDS protest. And so the Trinity authorities completely caved in to these students. But these students, they are extremely in sympathy of the movement to destroy Israel, in my opinion,
Yes.
and don't believe in a two-state solution. Um, and the students at Trinity were kind of romanticized and treated as heroes by the Irish media. You see, that
Yeah.
again is the problem. They become very careless about the sort of people they begin to romanticize and what these people who they think are romantic really want. And
Hmm.
this is the sort of thing I try to highlight. Are you aware of who you are sympathizing with here?
So
And a lot of the time they're
lastly,
not.
yeah, exactly. Well, I'm not sure that I think a lot of the times the leaders for sure are, and they don't care.
Mm,
I interviewed Ayan Hirsi Ali not too long ago, and she said
mm,
a very important point, and I think it's overlooked that the left, and it looks like Ireland is controlled by various degrees of left. There's
mm,
nothing to the center right. So,
mm. Not
but
really.
so the
Not on
left,
this.
yeah, exactly. And the left in general wants to tear down the system. They
Mm-hmm.
feel that, we're racist, misogynist,
Mm,
transphobic, Islamophobic, all the phobics,
mm, mm,
and they
mm,
want to
mm,
tear it all down.
mm,
And they don't have a plan what will be after they get tear down. That's what she said. And I tend to agree. They never talk about what will be after. The
mm,
people who they're aligning with, the Islamists in the world and in the West, they have a specific plan what they want to do when they tear down the
mm,
system. They're
mm,
going to replace it with the caliphate. And
mm,
when that caliphate comes, those leftists, they're going to be thrown into the sea with all of us. So it's like they'll be eaten alive by their allies now. And so I tend to it's even and if they don't see it, it's a sort of willful blindness, which That's the way I look at it, is
It's
that
the
you don't,
weird, it's what I, this weird intersectional
yes,
alliance, as
exactly.
I like to call it. We're all minorities, therefore we're all on the same page. And
Exactly.
no, you're not.
100%. And I would just
Mm,
say about the criticism of Israel. In Israel itself, there are protests in the street every day now,
mm,
against the government, against different actions that it takes. The government in the polls is not, I did not vote for the parties that are in the coalition now. So we have there's you don't have to agree even as an Israeli with
hmm.
anything the government's doing. You should be able to agree that Israel has the right to exist, to defend itself. Again, to the degree that it does, we can argue about that, but
Mm,
I think the general agreement should be okay. You have a right to defend yourself. You have a right to exist. And then we can talk about how you do it and all
mm,
that. But if you
mm.
can't even agree to those two specific, very basic things,
You don't have a
we're in a
starting
very
point.
bad place. Exactly. We
Yeah.
can't even talk. And
Mm,
that's a problem, I think.
mm, mm.
So David, lastly, I was going to ask you if there's anything we could do about it to make the situation better, but it seems to me that, and maybe that from everything you spoke about, there's really nothing, at least that Israel can do. It's not like if Israel would on October 7th say, okay, we're not doing anything and we're just going to give Hamas everything it wants and just give
Mm,
it back the hostages and we'll survive.
mm.
At this, the Irish people in general were hating Israel way before October 7th.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying at the beginning, the average Irish person forced to give an opinion will be critical of Israel, but it's not something that's uppermost in
Yeah.
their mind. So the
But
hostility,
the elites.
yes, the elites extremely, extremely much. I mean, so I think for the time being, the problem is intractable,
Yes.
and it's. I don't think there'll be an Israeli ambassador back here for quite some time. And even if things settle down, we say, I don't know, in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, a future Israeli ambassador is still going to have no politicians he or
Exactly.
she can work with. So this is not going to change for the foreseeable future, unfortunately.
This has been one of the most depressing
I'm sorry.
but but it is important to, I guess, understand where people are coming from. I think, like, first of all, I want to say that I don't, how did you, in living in a place like Ireland where everybody thinks, everyone, large majority
Mm.
thinks the way we just explained, how did you, how are you speaking to me like the way you are? Like, where's that coming from?
Well, I think part of the reason is, and actually gives me an opportunity to mention him, my father for years was the head of the Ireland Israeli Friendship League.
Aha,
In fact,
okay.
he has a tree planted in his honor in Israel. And
Ah,
he was given by a previous Israeli ambassador, the first one to Ireland. Actually, he's dead now, Zvi Gabai, who actually his family is from Iraq.
mm-hmm.
And so he's one of the dark skinned Jews you were talking about. So he got a Jerusalem 3000 medal because my father, right, he is also a journalist. Right from the 60s and before, would have been arguing we need to have an Israeli ambassador in Ireland. And my father campaigned for that to happen and was thrilled when it happened. I always remember when the raid in Entebbe happened. I was only a boy at the time, and I think we were on a summer holiday, and my father absolutely thrilled when the Israeli commandos went in and rescued the hostages at Entebbe Airport in Uganda. So these are kind of my memories. So I think I think I'm my father's son, basically,
Yeah.
in this respect.
So
Yeah.
what you're saying is that the propaganda around in the public sphere
Mm,
you were able to sort of, because of your home and your
mm.
education from in-house, you were able to sort of insulate yourself from the hatred outside that was being, I guess, trying people tr basically if you're going to school in Ireland, watching TV in Ireland, you would be propagandized, but because you had that firm upbringing, you were able to, I guess, insulate yourself.
Yeah, and it was only probably from the 1980s and the wars in Lebanon that the real kind of anti-Israeli
Yes.
feeling began to rise up in Ireland. So I was growing up in Ireland when there was a lot less of that, and the kind of Leon Uris exodus view of the foundation of Israel would have been more common here than it was, and that was certainly my father's view.
Yeah. David Quinn, I have to say, again, depressing, but also I think it's amazing that you are able to. First of all, it's nice of, I guess, of your editors to allow someone who is so out of the mainstream in your country to, on this issue at least, to speak out and write in the
No,
most
it's
wide.
good.
Yeah. So that's good, and I implore you to keep on bringing out this. the important message. Whether people agree with Israel or not, the Jews in Ireland at least should be safe and not feel any hardships, just like any other
Mm,
person.
mm.
And they should be allowed to obviously give their opinions without being spat at or all this kind of stuff. So I appreciate all the work you're doing.
Thank you.
It was depressing, but also very interesting and important, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.